Iran's own tallest bridge, the pride of an entire province, inaugurated just months earlier as a symbol of modern engineering, came down in a matter of seconds. And it did not come down by accident. This is not a natural disaster story. This is not an engineering failure. This is a deliberate, announced, repeated military strategy that has now flattened, cracked, or completely severed more bridges inside Iran than most people can even count. And the man behind the strategy told everyone exactly what was coming before it happened. Every single time Iran fires a missile, a drone, or a rocket at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, the United States destroys a bridge or a power plant inside Iran in direct response. And that includes structures sitting right next to the capital itself. That is not a rumor. That is not analyst speculation. That is a direct policy stated publicly in writing by the President of the United States. And it has been carried out again and again over the past several months with brutal consistency. So today we're breaking down exactly how this bridge for a missile strategy started, which structures have actually been hit, the human cost tied to those strikes, why targeting bridges is such a specific and calculated form of pressure, and where this entire escalating standoff over the Strait of Hormuz is heading next. Because based on the latest reporting coming out just in the past day, this fight is nowhere near finished. Let's talk numbers first, because the scale of this bridge campaign is honestly staggering once you lay it all out. Iranian health officials have reported that in a single stretch of strikes running through the middle of July alone, at least 50 people were killed and more than 500 injured, with infrastructure damage spreading across at least 10 different Iranian cities. A desalination plant on a peninsula near the Strait of Hormuz was hit hard enough to cut off water access for 10,000 residents. 6 separate bridges connecting cities in Hormozgan province, the province that contains the critical port city overlooking the strait itself, were targeted in a single coordinated wave. Legal scholars have already started raising alarm bells over whether repeatedly striking bridges and power infrastructure that civilians rely on every single day crosses into war crime territory under international law. A claim that is obviously going to be one of the most contested legal debates to come out of this entire conflict once historians start writing the final account of it. And on top of the human cost, there's the geopolitical chess move sitting underneath every single one of these strikes. Because bridges are not just concrete and steel connecting one town to another. Bridges are logistics. Bridges are how you move missile launchers, how you resupply coastal military positions, how you get personnel and equipment from the interior of a country out to the coastline, where the actual naval confrontation with the United States is happening. Cut the bridges, and you don't just inconvenience commuters. You strangle a military's ability to reinforce and resupply its own front line. That is precision, economic, and military pressure disguised as infrastructure strikes. And it is working exactly the way it was designed to work. And this is not a new idea in warfare, even if the current scale of it feels unprecedented to anyone watching this conflict unfold in real time. Militaries have targeted bridges for as long as bridges have existed, because a bridge is one of the rare pieces of infrastructure where destroying a relatively small, cheap, easily targeted structure can completely paralyze the movement of an enemy force across an entire region. You don't need a massive bunker-busting bomb to take out a bridge span. You need precision and timing. That's exactly why bridges have shown up as priority targets in nearly every major conflict of the last century. From strategic bombing campaigns that specifically hunted rail bridges to cut off enemy lines to more recent conflicts where a handful of well-placed strikes on key crossings did more to slow an advancing or retreating force than an entire week of strikes on troop concentrations elsewhere. What makes the current Iran campaign genuinely different is the deliberate, publicly announced linkage between a specific enemy action, a missile fired at a commercial ship, and a specific American response, a bridge coming down somewhere inside Iran. That's not classic wartime infrastructure targeting quietly buried inside a broader campaign plan. That's a publicly declared tit-for-tat scoreboard, updated in near real time with civilian infrastructure sitting as the running total for the entire world to watch. So let's go back to where this whole bridge strategy actually started, because the origin point matters enormously here. Back in early April, during an earlier and separate phase of this broader war, one of Iran's most significant pieces of modern infrastructure, a massive unfinished highway bridge linking the capital to a nearby western city, considered by many to be the tallest bridge in the entire Middle East and only inaugurated earlier that same year, was struck by 2 missiles and partially collapsed on camera in front of the entire world. This wasn't some remote military installation buried in a mountain. This was a brand new civilian highway bridge, and the timing of the strike could not have been worse because it happened on the last day of the Persian New Year festival, a day when families traditionally gather outdoors to picnic and celebrate together, and reports on the ground said many of the casualties were residents from a nearby village who had gathered beneath that exact bridge to celebrate that exact holiday. 8 people were confirmed killed in that first strike, with more than 95 wounded, and then it got worse because, according to Iranian state media, a second strike hit the same location after first responders had already arrived to help the wounded, a tactic known in military circles as a double tap strike, killing at least 2 more people in the process, including some of the very people who had rushed in to save others. The provincial governor at the time stated flatly that there was absolutely no military activity happening on that bridge when it was hit. Whether or not you believe every word of that claim, the optics of a newly built civilian highway bridge collapsing over families celebrating a national holiday became one of the defining images of the entire war, and it set the template for everything that followed. Just days later, a railway bridge near a central Iranian city was also struck, killing 2 more people and injuring 3 others. And a separate highway bridge connecting 2 major northern cities in the country's north was hit and closed as well. President Trump himself publicly celebrated the original bridge strike at the time, posting footage of the explosion and framing it as proof that Iran would face escalating consequences until it came back to the negotiating table, while Iranian state broadcasters ran their own footage from the opposite angle, emphasizing the civilian casualties and accusing the United States of deliberately targeting families rather than any legitimate military target. Iran's own military spokespeople responded by claiming they had already identified multiple bridges inside American allied nations across the region as potential retaliatory targets. A threat that, as we'll get to shortly, did not stay theoretical for very long. This wasn't a one-time incident, and it wasn't a single unfortunate strike that got walked back afterward. This was the opening chapter of a pattern that has now repeated itself over and over across multiple months of conflict, with each new round somehow finding a way to escalate past the one before it. Now fast forward past a brief ceasefire that both sides actually signed onto in the early summer, an interim agreement that for a short window seemed to actually cool things down. That calm did not last. The truce shattered when Iran was accused of targeting a merchant vessel that was ultimately abandoned by its own crew after catching fire in the strait. And from that point forward, the entire standoff reignited with a vengeance, with Iran formally announcing it was closing the Strait of Hormuz and then launching missiles and drones at neighboring Gulf countries in retaliation for renewed American strikes. That closure of the strait is the single most important variable in this entire story, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just some regional waterway. It is one of the most strategically vital choke points on the planet for global energy supply, with a massive percentage of the world's seaborne oil and gas exports passing through it every single day. Threaten that waterway, and you're not just threatening Iran's neighbors, you're threatening energy markets and economies on every continent. That is exactly why the American response to this renewed threat became so aggressive so quickly, and it's exactly why President Trump laid out that direct public ultimatum that has defined the entire second half of this bridge campaign. His statement was blunt, almost to the point of sounding like a dare. From that point forward, any time the Islamic Republic of Iran shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether by missile, rocket, drone, or any other device or weapon, the United States would bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant. And he specifically added that this included structures located next to or inside the capital city itself. That last part matters more than people realize, because targeting infrastructure near the capital is a direct signal to the regime's own leadership that their inner circle, their own seat of power, is no longer untouchable ground. It's one thing to strike remote coastal military sites. It's an entirely different message when you're telling a regime that the roads and power lines feeding their own capital city are now on the table. And Iran did not stay quiet after that threat went public. An Iranian brigadier general responded almost immediately, warning that any American strike on Iranian infrastructure would be met with what he called a crushing blow against regional infrastructure belonging to America's allies. The threat turned out to be more than just rhetoric, because in the days that followed, Iran launched a direct attack on a base in Syria for what was reported as the first time in this entire conflict, struck water infrastructure inside Kuwait hard enough to damage a power and desalination plant there, and hit American positions in Jordan. an attack that reportedly killed at least 3 American soldiers. Separately, a strike attributed to American forces on a border crossing between Iran and Iraq, an area where hundreds of pilgrims had reportedly gathered at the time, killed 2 people, according to Iranian state media. Another one of those grim incidents where the line between legitimate military target and civilian tragedy gets blurred almost beyond recognition. And on the water infrastructure front specifically, a reported strike on a desalination plant in the peninsula town of Jask, sitting right outside the mouth of the strait, destroyed pumping stations that Iranian officials say directly affected water supply for roughly 10,000 nearby residents. The same water crisis figure that's been cited repeatedly throughout this campaign as one of the clearest examples of civilians paying the price for a fight that's fundamentally about military control of a waterway, not about denying anyone's access to drinking water. So this became a genuine tit-for-tat escalation ladder with each side raising the stakes in direct response to the other. And Bridges sitting right at the center of that ladder is the chosen symbol and mechanism of American retaliation. Central Command, running the American side of this campaign, began announcing these strikes almost nightly through the middle of July, with one statement noting that a particular round of strikes launched in the mid-afternoon Eastern Time had concluded hours later after hitting surveillance sites, military logistics infrastructure, underground weapon storage, and maritime capabilities across the south of the country. That specific round marked a full week of consecutive nightly strikes, and it was explicitly aimed at cutting off the country's most important port city from the rest of the nation's interior. A city that sits directly on the Strait of Hormuz and functions as one of the most critical nodes in Iran's entire ability to project military force into that waterway. Analysts following this closely have pointed out that this bridge and infrastructure targeting pattern looks less like random punishment and more like deliberate preparation, potentially laying the groundwork for some kind of expanded ground presence down the line. Because cutting logistics routes before any potential ground operation is a textbook move, not an improvised one. It's worth pausing here to actually explain why the Strait of Hormuz matters enough for both sides to be willing to trade bridges and casualties over it. Because without that context, none of this makes sense as anything more than random destruction. This narrow stretch of water separates Iran from the Arabian Peninsula, and an enormous share of the entire planet's seaborne oil and natural gas exports has to physically pass through it to reach global markets. Because there simply aren't many practical alternate routes for that volume of energy shipping. Earlier in the same broader conflict, when the United States first imposed a naval blockade preventing ships from leaving Iranian ports through the strait, the Pentagon estimated that blockade alone had already cost Iran close to $5 billion in lost oil revenue within just a few weeks. That number tells you everything about why Iran considers control of this waterway a matter of national survival rather than a negotiable bargaining chip. It also tells you why the United States considers keeping that waterway open a matter of global economic stability rather than just a regional squabble. Every time a tanker gets threatened, mined, boarded, or struck in that strait, insurance premiums for shipping companies spike, energy markets get jittery, and countries thousands of miles away that have nothing to do with this war start feeling the financial ripple effects at the gas pump. That's the actual stakes sitting underneath every single bridge strike we've been talking about. It's not really about the bridges. The bridges are just the chosen instrument. It's about who ultimately controls the flow of one of the most important waterways on the planet. And neither side currently looks anywhere close to backing down on that core question. If you're finding this level of detail useful in actually understanding the why behind these headlines, rather than just the what, this is a good moment to go ahead and hit that like button, because breakdowns like this only reach more people trying to actually follow the conflict when the engagement is there to push it further. Now let's get into exactly how Iran responded once American strikes started hitting closer to its own infrastructure and further from just military targets, because the retaliation side of this story deserves just as much attention as the bridges themselves. Let's actually look at the specific bridges that came down during this most intense stretch of strikes, because the details here tell you exactly how surgical and how widespread this campaign became. In one southern coastal city that sits along the direct route connecting a smaller town to major port city itself, American strikes destroyed a key bridge along with a maritime control tower in the same overnight operation. Part of what was already the 6th consecutive night of attacks at that point. Iranian state media reported that at least 7 people were killed in that specific round. Photographs of a damaged bridge in that same region were geolocated and verified by international news organizations, confirming the structure had indeed been hit exactly where Iranian sources claimed. In total, Iran reported that 6 separate bridges connecting multiple cities near its southern coastline, including routes running directly into that critical port city, were struck in the single wave alongside additional strikes on power infrastructure supplying the region. One particularly telling image that circulated afterward showed a bridge along the road connecting 2 towns south of the port city. Its span visibly broken, sitting right in the middle of the exact corridor that would be used to move Iranian military hardware toward the coast. This wasn't scattershot bombing. This was a methodical dismantling of the specific road network that ties Iran's most important waterfront military assets to the rest of the country. And every single bridge on that list served a direct logistical purpose beyond simply connecting 2 towns for the sake of daily commuting. Here's where we need to slow down and do the honesty check, because a story this dramatic deserves scrutiny from every angle rather than a one-sided highlight reel. Iran's own health ministry has been the primary source for most of the civilian casualty figures tied to these strikes, and that means those numbers, while almost certainly reflecting real deaths and real injuries, are also being reported by a government with every incentive to maximize sympathy and international pressure against the United States. That doesn't mean the casualty figures are fabricated. Independent geolocation of strike damage by international news organizations has repeatedly confirmed that these bridges really were hit exactly where and when Iranian sources claimed, cross-referencing satellite imagery, timestamps, and on-the-ground photography to verify that the structures shown in state media footage match the actual coordinates being reported. That kind of independent verification matters enormously in a conflict where both governments have every incentive to spin the narrative in their own favor. And it's genuinely reassuring from a journalistic standpoint that outside fact-checkers keep confirming the physical reality of these strikes, even when they can't independently confirm every casualty figure attached to them. But it does mean the exact death tolls, the exact framing of who was standing where when a strike happened, deserves the same careful skepticism you'd apply to any wartime reporting coming out of either side of an active conflict. Because a regime under this much military and economic pressure has every reason to frame every single strike in the most sympathetic light possible, just as any government fighting a war is always done throughout history. On the American side, there's a parallel skepticism worth applying. Because describing every single struck bridge purely as logistics infrastructure conveniently avoids ever having to publicly weigh the civilian cost of that decision in the same breath. International humanitarian law does recognize that infrastructure serving both civilian and military purposes, so-called dual-use infrastructure, can in some circumstances be a legitimate target. But that legal allowance comes with a proportionality requirement, meaning the expected military advantage gained from destroying a target has to be weighed against the expected harm to civilians. Whether a strike campaign that has now taken out roughly a dozen bridges across multiple provinces over several months still clears that proportionality bar, or whether it has drifted into something closer to a deliberate campaign against a nation's ability to function as a connected society, is exactly the kind of question international law experts and eventually war crimes tribunals spend years arguing about long after the strikes themselves have stopped making headlines. At the same time, the American side has consistently described these bridge strikes purely in terms of military logistics infrastructure. Language that conveniently sidesteps the obvious reality that every one of these bridges was also simultaneously a piece of civilian infrastructure used daily by ordinary people, with zero connection to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or any military supply chain. Both of those things can be true at once. A bridge can genuinely serve a legitimate military logistics function while also being the same bridge a school teacher drives across every morning. And that dual-use reality is exactly why legal scholars are raising war crime concerns in the first place. International humanitarian law does allow for strikes on dual-use infrastructure under certain proportionality standards. But repeatedly targeting an entire province's bridge network night after night, week after week, is the kind of pattern that draws exactly the level of legal scrutiny currently being raised. There's also a bigger picture element worth folding in here, because this fight over the Strait of Hormuz is not happening in a vacuum, and outside actors are increasingly shaping how accurate and effective these strikes on both sides actually are. Recent statements out of Ukraine's own leadership have claimed that Russia is providing Iran with satellite imagery specifically covering American base locations across the Gulf region. imagery that would directly support Iranian targeting and battle damage assessment against those same American positions. If accurate, that would mean this entire regional confrontation over a waterway thousands of miles from Ukraine is quietly being fed by intelligence sharing tied to an entirely different global conflict, which tells you just how interconnected these modern wars have become. Everyone is watching everyone else's fight for lessons, resources, and leverage. And no regional conflict stays purely regional anymore once major global powers start treating it as an opportunity to test relationships, technology, and influence against each other by proxy. So, where does this actually stand as of the most recent reporting available? According to the latest tracked assessments coming out just in the past day, there appears to be at least a temporary pause in the pace of American air operations, with Iranian officials signaling through state media that they intend to maintain what they're calling a posture of retaliation readiness while refraining from initiating new attacks, provided that pause on the American side holds. That is a notably fragile arrangement, not a ceasefire, not a peace deal, just an informal mutual hesitation that could collapse the moment either side decides the other has crossed a line. Analysts tracking the situation closely have assessed that the current level and intensity of American strikes has likely failed to meaningfully shift the Iranian regime's underlying strategic objective, which remains long-term control over the Strait of Hormuz, regardless of the cost being paid in infrastructure and casualties. Iranian officials have reportedly told international reporters they would reject any ceasefire proposal that leaves the actual status of control over the strait ambiguous, meaning the core issue driving this entire bridge for missile exchange hasn't actually been resolved, it's just been paused. And Iran's own negotiating team has separately suggested that the broader interim memorandum of understanding signed earlier this summer is effectively suspended, given what they characterize as repeated American violations of it, which tells you that even the paper agreement both sides once signed onto no longer carries much practical weight in how either government is actually behaving on the ground. The White House, for its part, has tried to keep at least a thin diplomatic door open even in the middle of all this destruction, with officials publicly stating that the president remains open to a negotiated resolution, while simultaneously making clear that Iran will not be allowed to fire on ships in the strait without facing a direct consequence for it. That's a genuinely difficult position to hold publicly, insisting you want diplomacy, while also running one of the most sustained infrastructure bombing campaigns of the entire conflict. But it does reflect the actual strategic logic driving this bridge for missile framework in the first place. The theory, at least as officials have described it, is that visible, painful, immediately traceable consequences tied directly to specific Iranian actions will eventually make continuing to threaten shipping in the strait more costly than it's worth for Tehran, forcing a return to serious negotiations out of simple economic necessity rather than goodwill. Whether that theory actually holds up against a regime that has already shown a willingness to absorb enormous civilian and infrastructure losses rather than concede control of the waterway is very much the open question hanging over everything happening right now. Let's talk strategy for a moment, because this bridge campaign represents something genuinely different from a typical military targeting doctrine, and it's worth understanding why. Most wartime infrastructure targeting historically focuses on power grids, communications networks, and fuel depots, the kind of targets that directly a military's ability to fight in the immediate term. Bridges occupy a strange middle ground. They're slower to matter tactically because a determined military can often find alternate routes, temporary crossings, or rebuild critical spans faster than most people expect. And Iranian state media has already reported doing exactly that in several cases, quickly establishing alternative routes to keep the South connected to the rest of the country even after individual bridges went down. But bridges carry enormous symbolic and psychological weight that raw military logistics targets simply don't. A destroyed bridge is visible, it's photographable. It sits there as a permanent, undeniable image of a nation's vulnerability broadcast across state media and international outlets alike, whether the government wants that image circulating or not. Targeting bridges is as much a message as it is a military maneuver, a way of proving that no structure, however new, however symbolically important, however close to the seat of national power, is beyond reach. That is precisely why the president's original threat specifically called out infrastructure near the capital itself. It wasn't really about the military value of any single bridge outside Tehran. It was about eliminating the psychological safety net that comes with assuming your own capital sites outside the blast radius of a war happening hundreds of miles away on the coast. There's also a slower, quieter form of pressure baked into this entire bridge campaign that doesn't get nearly as much attention as the dramatic collapse footage. And that's the sheer cost and time it takes to rebuild any of this. A modern highway bridge, especially one built to handle heavy freight and military-grade vehicle loads, isn't something you patch up with a construction crew in a weekend. Rebuilding a single major span can take months or years and require specialized engineering resources, steel, and funding that a country already hemorrhaging billions of dollars in blocked oil revenue is going to struggle to prioritize. Every bridge that comes down doesn't just create an immediate logistics headache. It creates a long-term drain on a national budget that's already being stretched thin by the broader costs of fighting this war on multiple fronts simultaneously. Iranian officials have tried to project resilience by publicly announcing alternative routes and temporary crossings almost as fast as bridges go down, which is a smart short-term messaging move. But temporary detours are never a real substitute for a permanent high-capacity highway or rail crossing, and everyone on both sides of this conflict knows it. And that brings us to the actual question hanging over everything happening right now, the one nobody currently has a confident answer to. Does this bridge-for-missile strategy actually change Iranian behavior in the Strait, or does it just add another layer of destruction and casualties to a standoff that was always going to be decided by who blinks first over control of that waterway? History with this exact kind of proportional retaliation strategy is genuinely mixed. Sometimes visible escalating infrastructure pressure does eventually force a regime back to the negotiating table out of sheer economic exhaustion, especially when water plants, power grids, and transportation routes start failing badly enough that domestic unrest becomes a bigger threat to the regime than the foreign adversary bombing them. Other times, this exact kind of pressure campaign hardens a government's public position precisely because backing down in the face of visible bombardment looks like weakness that could threaten a regime's grip on power even more than the physical damage itself. Right now, it genuinely looks like Iran is leaning toward the second path, publicly signaling they won't accept any resolution that leaves their control over the Strait even slightly ambiguous, even after 50-plus deaths, hundreds of injuries, a water crisis affecting thousands of residents, and now an entire province's bridge network sitting in ruins. That's either a sign of genuine strategic resolve or sign of a regime that has boxed itself into a corner it can no longer politically afford to retreat from. And honestly, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. And what do you think happens from here? Do you think this fragile pause holds and both sides quietly work towards some kind of updated agreement over the Strait, or do you think the moment either side sees an opening, we're right back to nightly strikes and another wave of bridges coming down? Drop your take in the comments because the range of predictions on where this actually goes next has been genuinely split among people following this closely, and it's worth hearing different angles on it rather than just assuming one outcome is obvious. If this breakdown actually helped you understand the bigger picture behind these headlines instead of just the scary photos of collapsed bridges circulating online, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed analysis reach more people who are trying to actually follow this conflict rather than just react to it. Share it with anyone in your circle who's been asking what's actually going on with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz lately, because this bridge strategy is one of the most misunderstood parts of the entire war right now. And most casual headlines don't explain the reasoning behind it the way we just did. And make sure you're subscribed, because given how fragile this current pause actually is, and given how quickly this exact cycle of strike and retaliation has restarted multiple times already this year, there's a very real chance we'll be right back here breaking down the next round of strikes sooner than anyone would like. And if you're new here, and this is the first time you're getting a breakdown like this instead of just a headline scroll, consider sticking around because conflicts like this one rarely move in a straight line. And understanding the reasoning behind each escalation is the only way any of these headlines actually start to make sense together, instead of feeling like a random string of scary news alerts. Thanks for watching this one all the way through, and we'll see you in the next breakdown.